front. And if you could, please silence your cell phones. So welcome back from lunch. I hope everyone had a chance to go downstairs and make a new friend and participate in and meet the folks from the journal. If you did, that's really exciting. Thank you for joining us again. I hope you are ready for a full afternoon of food history. I know I am. Our next roundtable, Reclaiming the Pacific Northwest, will dive deep into the Pacific Northwest as a region, exploring the ways people have protected, claimed, exploited, and reclaimed the region's food resources and traditions. Following the pattern of the morning roundtables, each discussion will be an hour, with the last 15 minutes dedicated to audience questions. You can tweet your questions with the hashtag Smithsonian Food, or you can fill out the cards you received on your way in and hand them to an usher on the sides. Then my colleague Amelia Grabowski in the back of the room will ask a few of those questions for you all. I am honored to introduce our moderator, Rebecca Den. She's a journalist and regular contributor to the Seattle Times and the chief food writer and restaurant critic for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. She also curated the 2017 Edible City exhibition on Seattle's food history for the Museum of History and Industry. Rebecca, please take it away.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? What do I do next? Oh, good, much better. Thank you. And thank you for coming today. As he was just saying, I spent about 2 years working on an exhibit for Seattle's Museum of History and Industry on Seattle food. And we started out by saying, what is a Seattle food? And it was sort of stunning what a difficult question that was to answer. We said, of course, salmon. And yes, except sort of our signature food is Copper River salmon, and that comes from Alaska, just by its name. And we said, well, there's our beautiful, beautiful yellow-red Rainier cherries. And we looked into it a little bit, and that is a cross that was developed by a Washington State University professor back in the 1950s. So it is ours, but it's not quite what we were thinking. And then we have some unofficial foods in our city, which include chicken teriyaki platters and also pho noodle soup. So after a lot of thinking, we did come up with some answers, but it also became very clear that Northwest food depends to a great extent on who you are and where you came from. And I think our panelists today, who are very distinct, very different, and all very definitively Northwest, might help us address some of those questions. So I'm going to start with some introductions, and then we'll hear more about their views on all this. To your right, we have Elizabeth Woody. She's an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, Oregon, and is of Yakama Nation descent. She's also connected through her father to the Navajo Nation. Elizabeth recently served as Oregon's Poet Laureate. She's a writer, a teacher, a visual artist, and I wanted to read you just a little bit about her connection to food from the introduction to her book, 7 Hands, 7 Hearts. It starts, my childhood home was 14 miles from the Warm Springs Reservation in the town of Madras, Oregon. We were over 100 miles from the Columbia River and the pathways of the salmon that my mother's people cherished, celebrated, harvested, dried, and incorporated into their lifeways for over 14,000 years. Although we were removed from our ancestral homeland of the Columbia River system, that landscape, the snow-capped Cascade Range of volcanoes, surrounded by evergreen forests and high desert, is still an integral element of the culture of the Plateau Columbia people, as we are collectively called. I belong to a people who cherish the land. To your left, Gail Goshi, a fourth-generation farmer in Oregon's Willamette Valley. Her family farm grows more than 550 acres of hops. It is a major Northwest crop. If you would like to thank us for craft beer, we are here for it. It's also one with a fascinating history of its own, starting in the Northwest to support the fur trapping industry and the settlements there at the turn of the 19th century. Gail's farm also has 150 plus acres of wine grapes. These are also a Northwest crop, a major one, although 50 years ago, no one would have thought that. And also other crops, including corn and wheat. We talked a little bit with Gail about how in farming, as well as in family businesses, you need to look back in time as well as towards the future. And I am looking forward to hearing some of her thoughts on the moral, cultural, and especially the environmental issues around growing foods in the Northwest. In the center of our panelists, you have Chef Eduardo Jordan. In the past few years, he's become probably the chef most emblematic of our region. He has won just about every award we have to offer. We're running out of them, including 2 James Beard Awards just this year for Best Chef in the Northwest and Best New Restaurant in the United States. He has 2 restaurants currently, Solari, which is, I think fair to say, more European-influenced fine dining, and June Baby, which is Southern influence with all of its global history. He's about to open his 3rd, Lucinda, based on heirloom grains, also very connected to Northwest's past and present with food.
Well, in Seattle.
Oh, so sorry, in Seattle.
Yeah.
The chef was raised in Florida. He went on after culinary school to restaurants like the celebrated French Laundry in Napa Valley and Sitka and Spruce and Bar Sayor in Seattle, which became some of the first restaurants, I think, to think about what it meant to be of the Northwest. It's especially interesting to me that he is a relative newcomer to our region and yet also has become our signature chef. And which I think says something about food in the Northwest and how it's developing and evolving. So I'd just like to start by asking each of our panelists if they can talk a little bit about why it tends to be so difficult to define Pacific Northwest food. It's not like Southern food or California cuisine. Why is it hard, and what does it mean to you? And should I just start in order and start with Gail?
Sure. I think I'm the least experienced to be able to answer this, so I'll start.
We're all experts.
You know, I see it as a sense of the Pacific Northwest really being relatively young. I mean, I come to the East Coast and I realize that there's history certainly way before we settled in Oregon and Washington and Idaho. I think that we have a sense of independence about us that maybe doesn't allow us to really collectively put something together so easily. I also think that we're very curious and we're ready to explore new ideas. So when I think about Pacific Northwest food, I think about the meals that I share with my friends and family, and they can go any one of a number of directions. I as I said, I don't think I can answer it.
Well, I think I share the same difficulty of trying to define or understand what Pacific Northwest food is. When I first moved to Seattle about 10 years ago, the first thing I thought about with Seattle was like apples and salmon, and that was Pacific Northwest for me, essentially. It was farm to table. I think the easiest way I defined it was understanding the land and having a relationship with the farmers, and that kind of dictate what our food was and is. I think if we go deeper and further back, you get to think about the natives that actually influenced Seattle and the Pacific Northwest with their relationship with the water and the land and hunting, and teaching us about foraging and the mushrooms and herbal tonics and how to live off the land. And I think like that definition is the true Pacific Northwest cuisine. But now that we've had so many people come into Seattle from very diverse places in the world due to all the technology companies, Amazon and Microsoft and Nintendo. So we have all these diverse people coming in influencing the way that Pacific Northwest actually was. So it's still hard to define because we have so many different influences now. When I think about present day Pacific Northwest cuisine, past is, I think the natives had the biggest influence on what Pacific Northwest was.
Well, past the food of the hybridized food of the colonizers, there are a wide variety of foods in the Pacific Northwest. And food is considered a medicine, and also the cultivation of the foods was ongoing for thousands of years. The Willamette Valley in Oregon was managed by fire in the tribes there, so it would open and have these open oak savannas where acorns could be grown. All of the catching of fish was maintained and managed as a fisheries by the tribes and by lead fishers. You go towards the coast, there's abundance of food there. You go inland, there's abundance of food there. In fact, you have to be fairly ignorant or stubborn to starve. But it's true. When Lewis and Clark came to the Pacific Northwest, they refused to eat salmon, and they refused to eat the roots, and they didn't really, I don't think they ate much berries. They bought dogs and horses and killed them and ate them. And so much so that when they got to Nez Perce country, a young man came and threw a puppy in one of their laps and said, "Eat this." Because those were, our animals were like family, and it was appalling. And the other part of it I think that's important for us to remember is these traditions also are not cultural lifeways, but they're actually part of our ceremonial life and part of our ability to connect and manage our, what we call our little relatives. All of our foods are our little relatives. I'm only 2 generations removed from the traditional food. There's a lot of disease that comes with that. The wheat, the soy, I'm severely allergic to soy, overexposed to it, it's really horrible. And the Pacific is also part of the Ring of Fire. The ocean unites us. So Japan, North Kamchatka, into Korea, up into the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, all the way down to Baja, California, where salmon was salmon country. And people traversed the oceans for generations prior to the United States coming, or the Spanish coming, or the Russians coming. So there was a common kind of commonality between us, and we still respect that, and we still have a trader. We have this men's trade network, so we respect other people's customs and foods as well. So I think that that's part of why the Northwest may have lost its identity, but primarily it was part of this native network before it became the United States, and it will always be part of this native network as long as we're sovereign and as long as we still live.
I'm really struck, Elizabeth, by what you said about family. In one of your poems, I think, you had talked about making root bags, and how these will be homes for our little sisters. It was a lovely line, and I wonder if you could talk about just that idea a little more.
Sure, just real quickly. We have a technology that goes with our food preservation. We could actually harvest our materials and preserve them all year because of the baskets that we made, the way that we cooked our foods. Of course, you had to cook them a certain way, or you would get upset tummies like the Lewis and Clark people would experience. There's also, the bags are one of the biggest things, but all of the tools and implements that people created were most efficient and effective ways to capture, gather, dry, and preserve our foods.
And one thing we always say about the Northwest is that we have such abundant natural resources, and we have such diverse cultural communities. And that's true, but I think, as we heard it this morning also, other parts of the country have those things also. And I'm wondering if you three could do the work you do now, or to have the relationship you have with food now in any other part of the US. If you were transplanted to the Midwest or the East or the South, would you still be you? Would your work with food still be yours?
So that's an interesting question to answer. For our farm now, with primarily being hops and wine grapes, hops in particular are very dependent on day length as they go through their growing cycle every year to be able to bloom and then put the hop cones on. So the latitudes throughout the world where hops are being grown commercially are between 35 degrees and 50 degrees north latitude. And so if you get beyond that, you're having to manipulate the plant using possibly false lighting or something else to manipulate the day length. So there's that confining part to hops, which is unique to many other plants. With wine grapes, there are certainly areas that grow different types of grapes because of their temperatures, because of their rainfalls, and so for the Pacific Northwest, for Oregon, and the reason that the wine industry was actually begun in Oregon in the 60s, not very long ago, was because a group of young entrepreneurs that were in California involved in the industry came to the Pacific Northwest, came to Oregon to be able to grow grapes in a cool climate. Oregon is a very mild and a very cool climate. So for them, it was an experimentation to be able to see how grapes grown in Oregon would compete with the famous areas of Burgundy. And the industry actually did quite well and became well known within 20 years of being able to really be able to have a place at the table for a Burgundian wine. So there are those limitations.
That turned out well, though.
Yes, it did. Yeah.
Eduardo?
I think the short answer for me is yes, I could be placed in any other city, any other region, and do what I do. But I think it's the impact that I've had on Seattle is due to me bringing something different to the table. And I don't think I would have had the same impact in other places. I chose Seattle and the Pacific Northwest because of the natural resources that are there, the relationships that I've built with farmers, the seasons. Actually, I have real seasons here. In Florida, I didn't have real seasons.
But the East Coast has more seasons.
Yeah. But, you know, I spent time in the South. I'm born in the South. I spent time on the East Coast, the Northeast, and I spent time in the West, and from San Francisco up to Seattle. And it was just something about the West Coast, its vicinity to the ocean and fish and the fisheries, to the farmland, to being out in the woods. And I just felt closer to the food and understanding the food, you know, by being here in the Pacific Northwest. So I think, yes, I could have done it anywhere else, but I think just the impact of being here in the relationship that I built definitely creates something different.
Does it feel like home to you?
It is. It does. Home in different ways, yes. I mean, my family's from St. Petersburg, and yeah, I miss it, but I'm so attached to Seattle and the Pacific Northwest now. You know, I actually want to be out more. I want to be out in the woods and hopefully climbing mountains one day, not full-scale mountains, but, you know, just getting out there. But I don't know, there's a relationship. There's something a synergy that I love about where I'm at, and I wouldn't go anywhere else. So.
Of course, I've traveled to Japan, New Zealand, I've been in Mexico, I've traveled the United States, been in Canada, so I do have, wherever I go, respect for the food of the area. There's a lot of difficulty, though, I think, in terms of, you know, different cuisines. When I was in Japan, they presented me with this wonderful pink fish head, and I ate it, and they were quite surprised, and I said, well, we eat fish heads in Oregon, too. And when we were in New Zealand, of course, they wanted us to have an American Indian night, so I was at this international gathering of artists. And so we cooked, we went out to the store, we bought things that we knew, plants that were from our country, we prepared them as we would our own at home, with the exception that corn was too tough there, it doesn't soften. We had, well, anyway, when we cooked and cooked and cooked and cooked, and people came out of the woodwork to eat our foods because the way that we did it and the fact that we always prepare it with love. If you're angry, you get kicked out of the kitchen. If you're grouchy, you got to go. So we basically, that's how we approach food in preparation. But I think when we went to Mexico, we were told we had to eat whatever they fed us. And the Nahuatl, which are Aztecan Indians, fed us these dishes that were so amazing. And that's the first time I ever ate quinoa. But they didn't cook it like a big bowl. They had them floating in soup. So when I see people eat this big, massive amount of quinoa, I think, boy, they are overdoing it for themselves because of the nutrition. It's so packed nutritionally. But the thing is that backfires. A young man who was courting a Navajo girl almost gagged and threw up eating mutton, and because he didn't like the taste of it. But I think it might have had to do with the fact that they butcher the mutton, they hit him in the head with an axe, and they disassemble everything. It's all in a wheelbarrow, and they eat everything. So I'm sure that had some impact on them. And a lot of the foods that we have in our midst are American in origin. You know, you can have the Sacred Sisters, the sisters corn, squash, and beans, pretty much anywhere in the world if you really want to. The oceans are connected, so if you have any connection to salmon, you basically have a reverence for all of those creatures that come from the ocean. So yes, of course, there's a relationship. But some things you can't eat. I can't eat raw squid. You know.
I can't either.
And I try. I mean, I gulp it down. And muktuk is very hard, which is fat from the seal. And the more you chew on it, the bigger it grows. That's why they give you little tiny squares. Like you throw it in your mouth, you masticate it a little bit, and you gulp it. And it's fine. It's kind of fishy.
Yeah.
When you are traveling and you're eating, do you feel that you are not eating your food, that you are eating your food? I mean, how much is food connected to your sense of place or of who you are?
It becomes a part of me regardless of where I'm eating it or where it's from. It's part of my individual sovereignty as a human being when I consume food. I think that my partaking of people's food, you know, is out of respect for what they're giving me. If I'm in a restaurant, I choose whole if I can. I always ask for ingredients. I always ask about salmon. Is it farmed or is it wild? Because I won't eat farmed fish. That's dangerous. And shrimp. I'm sorry. There's a lot of shrimp you can't eat because it's grown in horrible conditions. So people need to treat their food with respect when they're growing it, and they have to treat it with respect after they harvest it. And that's more important to me than anything.
Makes sense. I'm also curious about not cooking when you're angry and getting kicked out of the kitchen. What if you're cooking alone? Do you have to be aware of this?
You have to stop. You have to stop because what you do is you're imbuing your nourishment,
Your energy too.
your energy into this food, and you could cause yourself harm because one, people burn their food when they're upset. You waste it when you're upset. Wasting food is not a good thing. I mean, people consume probably more than they should, you know, in a lot of respects. But I think that it's really important for us to be mindful of a lot of things we do in our life.
Yeah, I think also that's something that I implement in my kitchens at the restaurant. It's a happy kitchen. We want to put love into our food. If we're walking in angry or upset or sad or, you know, not in the right mindset, we're not putting the right energy into the food. And so I always try to practice on having a warm, exciting, loving environment in my kitchens, even for the wait staff, you know, walking in, smiling, everyone shakes hands and give a hug if you need to check in on them before we start actually cooking.
I love that, and it goes so against the sort of traditional chef stereotype of you're swearing and you're yelling, and it's just the opposite. So was that hard for you to create a new paradigm?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've worked in many restaurants where there's a lot of swearing and you know, bad mojo just in the kitchen. You walked in on eggshells already because you know you're gonna get yelled at. And when I opened up my first restaurant, Solari, I knew I wanted to have an open kitchen so that my cooks are well aware of the environment that they are creating in the kitchen, myself also, and then also my guests are aware of what our environment is. And, you know, we have people sitting right in front of us and they say, you know, you guys are some of the hardest working people I've ever seen, but you guys are all smiling. And it's because like that's what me as a leader is implementing in my system as an owner, as a chef, because that's not the environment. That's the environment that I want to work in now because I've been in those other environments, and you just don't feel good as a cook going home, knowing that you just got scolded or you burnt yourself because you know you weren't focused, or you know you cut yourself because chef was yelling at you. It's just it doesn't create a great chef in the long run or great food.
Gail, you brought up the narrow growing zone for hops, or the temperature zone, which sort of brings up all the environmental issues that we're facing. And I'm curious, I've read some about the warming environment, how our wine industry might be in danger or might be changing or evolving with climate change. We've talked about how our salmon are in crisis. Can we remove dams? Should we? Is it possible? And I'm wondering if you can each speak a little bit about whether and how you see climate change affecting how you do your work and what's happening with our foodways in the near future.
Right. With growing wine grapes, we've only been at it for a little over 10 years. And I say we've only been at it for a little over 10 years because this next harvest for hops will be our 115th. So there's a little difference in the experience. But as I have started to go to wine grape industry meetings and seminars for the last 6 years of attending the primary seminars in our area, the lead speaker of every one of those years was the climatologist. And the industry has become very concerned with the changes in the climate. Oregon presently is not really affected. We're you know, when I sit and I look at the news and see what's happening throughout the rest of the United States and the rest of the world, I feel thankful every day that we have not have had the extremes that I'm seeing elsewhere. But we're affected in that we have an industry in California that is being affected. And so wineries are looking to Oregon to possibly move their acreage or at least start some new acreage. And so what that means is that first it means being in an area that is going to be, that they may not be able to grow the same grapes that they're growing now in Southern California, but as the future may bring, those Southern California wines may be grown in Oregon. So it's in a very, I think, very fast period of flux. For hops, a lot of the hops that are grown in Oregon the majority of the hops are what are considered flavor hops. So they're milder in taste and bitterness. And a lot of the rootstock, a lot of the beginnings of those varieties came from England, came from Germany, came from Czechoslovakia. And so the climates of those hop plants, when they were being transported and maybe crosses were being made off of that plant material in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that climate is not the same that we have today. We're seeing heat spikes in May that are affecting those varieties. So it's subtle changes, but it's definitely possibly industry changing in both those circumstances.
Does it keep you up at night?
Oh, I could be kept awake at night for a lot of things in farming. And so since it happens to be a slow change is what I'm seeing. And so it gives me an opportunity. It gives our farm, it gives the next generation an opportunity to be able to really make some hopefully educated guesses on this one and what to be able to do next.
I don't know if it affects you as a chef or gives you food for thought.
It does. It affects my farmers, which then affects me. Both of my restaurants are pretty much farmer-driven. They dictate pretty much what my menu looks like and how I use the ingredients that they provide. So, I think 3 years ago we had a water notice in Seattle, not a water shortage, but just making us aware that like the the ice caps they're melting too fast, and we're not keeping the ice up there on the mountain so they can be a slow drip so that we can actually supply the rivers later, which affects our farmers later on in the year where they may not have access to the water to, basically produce the produce that they produced in May or for August or so. So it's a slow change for me to adapt. It's definitely a slow change for my farmers, and I make changes due to what my farmers kind of dictate to me. So.
Well, I have a background in natural resources administration and environmental policy, and it has impacted, climate change has been impacting us for decades now. A lot of it has to do with the water quality and the temperatures of the water for the salmon and the fish. The overharvesting of the coastal temperate rainforests and the forests of the Cascades also affects our climate, our weather patterns. Old Indians used to say the trees cry for the rain. We no longer have those massive trees that used to be good for the environment and good for collecting and encouraging cloud formations. There's also the near coast ecosystem, the marine system used to have massive kelp forests underneath that change the kineticism of the ocean, and also the abundance of the fisheries that are in the near coast. There's longer breeding cycles for many fishes and many other types of shellfish and whatnot that need pure water and need to have some sort of buffer, and those things are also being impacted by the climate change that we're experiencing. We're going to have what's called massive water wars in the West. It's not just only Seattle, but I think in all of the western states and up into the Rockies, the water laws in the West are different than they are here on the East Coast. First in time, first in use, you have senior water rights. And the water that we have for the farmers in these arid places are over-allocated, meaning that when farming was encouraged for pioneers and settlement, oftentimes those waters were encouraged to be used so that the land could be quote-unquote tamed. And this also has caused a lot of agricultural runoff that's gone into the waters that's also impacted its quality. So we don't have a lot of water coming through, and we don't have a lot of water that's cold. And we have animals that are slowly going north and have been for a while, moose and beaver. And in fact, if we can get more beaver out there wild making dams, it would be much better for the waterways. We have in Oregon wolves now, and people want to go and hunt them, but wolves also improve the waterways. They keep the deer population down, they keep the, they cut down the trees around the riparian zone. So there's a lot of things that are checks and balances that happen, and climate change has impacted that severely, and that also includes the big Pacific Ocean currents. We have El Niños and La Niñas, and we're experiencing much more incidences of the kind that causes drought, which we're experiencing now, I think, for maybe 12 years, as far as I can recall. We've never had a regular snowfall or a regular rainfall. Mm-hmm. When I was growing up in the 60s, I'd catch the bus to Portland, and there would be, 20-foot snow piles. That's huge. Now there's not even 4 or 5 feet. So I think that, yeah, it does impact how I see the environment and how I see our food systems. And, I grew up in Central Oregon, where we have mint farmers, we have carrot seed growers, we have a lot of folks that are tied to the land as much as we are. And when there's a concern, most of the time they don't look at the tribes as an enemy, they look to the tribes as a collaborator or an ally to help them. And I think that when we manage, because we're co-managers, we're not just tribes, but we co-manage the system with the state and the feds. And so we have to go to bat for everybody, not just the tribes.
I think a lot of individuals feel a real sense of hopelessness when they look out and see that. And I wonder, is there anything that people can do on their own?
Well, there's an axiom in my culture that says, use only what you need and let the rest grow.
Sure.
That's probably the most simple way to approach it.
Thank you. Other factors that are affecting where our foodways are going. We've talked a little bit about how we got to where we are, And there's our natural resources and our landscape. There's all the people who have come and who continue to come and bring their own influences to our food. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how do you see us changing now, and what's coming ahead in what we call Northwest food?
Well, I think I kind of touched on this was, like with the major companies that are coming in, and I think we were like one of the fastest, at least Seattle was one of the fastest growing cities in the nation, and housing and trying to keep up with that. We're taking over, our natural land, and we're building high rises now. We're putting in more cars, so we're creating our own little cancer also at the same time as bringing resources into the city. So we're changing in that sense that we're taking away what was naturally there, what I originally knew of as the Pacific Northwest is depleting. I think the culture of the Pacific Northwest is changing too, due to the fact that we have so many different individuals coming into Seattle and are influencing the way that we think about Seattle now. We're slowly forgetting about like the natives and the influences that they had on the Northwest. With that said, like now I have so many different diverse palates coming into my restaurant at the same time too, and expectations, the way people travel now and what they expect of Seattle cuisine. Seattle cuisine always been casual. And now, there's this question of like, why don't we have fine dining in Seattle? Why are we ever going to create fine dining restaurants? I'm not sure if we need it. People never demanded it before, but now, we have these new bloods coming in saying, they want to have a fancy dinner with white tablecloths. And, I don't know if Seattle's ever really been that kind of city. And, it's changing.
It's interesting. We didn't have any restaurants like yours 10 years ago, but I wonder, could we have? I don't even know if we could have supported them.
Right.
Well, I worked at EcoTrust for 12 years, and EcoTrust is a nonprofit environmental organization working for social change and economic social change. And we had a farms to food program like 12 years ago. We had a lot of things happening with the Salmon Nation kind of awareness. And one of the things that we really try to encourage, of course, is being very conscious of where your food comes from. And most of Oregon, I think, would be in the food desert because of the way commerce is conducted between cities and rural areas. So you can have a hub of Portland in the metropolitan area and have all kinds of choices of what you can eat and be vegan and be this and be that. But then you have outside of Oregon the typical American cuisine with these big, huge platters of food, and not necessarily food that is really diverse. And it's been very critical, I think, for us to also be aware of the fact that Portland and Seattle have a very strong Asian influence. Vancouver, BC, the Chinese corporations and Chinese billionaires now are buying up massive amounts of land in Oregon and California. So there is going to be a major change because of economics, not because of what people are willing to do. So. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. And it's interesting what you said about the Asian influences. I was just thinking about how pho is sort of one of Seattle's unofficial foods, probably mostly because our governor, Dan Evans, back in the 1970s, welcomed Vietnamese refugees into the city.
Portland did too.
And so I was so surprised in a way to learn that, Los Angeles, which also has large Vietnamese populations, it's their unofficial food too. And I thought, wait, what does this mean? How can our food also be their food? And then I think of Morels as so very Northwest. But is it in Minnesota where they're also foraged? And I thought, we didn't steal their food and they didn't steal ours. I guess it can be of more than one place, even if it's just the same raw ingredient. We can't have this panel without talking a little bit more about salmon. And Elizabeth, you mentioned that you will not eat farmed salmon. I'd like to hear more about that. And if you could also tell me just where salmon fits into your life and your idea of Northwest food.
Well, salmon is sacred. We have 4 sacred foods, the salmon, the deer, roots and berries. If you go from the river to the mountains, that shows the whole spectrum. each one is gathered in its own season. Each one is celebrated with the first fruit ceremony in the Pacific Northwest, pretty much wherever you go. The salmon, when it's been farmed, has been pretty much caged so the flesh is soft. It's not firm. The other thing is they're given tons of antibiotics, which is bad for you. It stays in the system. And the other thing is it takes way more fish to feed as farm salmon than it does just to let the salmon run out in the ocean and eat on its own. So I think those are two things that those are three things that occur to me that why you shouldn't eat it. The other is that the salmon pens that they have in the ocean are polluting the system. They've been hard on, for example, I think the orcas and the other animals that live in the ocean. I think that the aspect of salmon versus farm salmon, or wild salmon versus farm salmon, is the wild salmon has been around for 2.5 million years. And the farm salmon that you eat is mostly Atlantic, and the Atlantic salmon is nearly extinct. So you have a salmon that has been coerced into living in the Pacific. Now that being said, I know that there's salmon that have been taken to New Zealand and have been running in New Zealand for a long time. And they brought those salmon back to Northern California so that they could repopulate a river. They're roaming. They like to roam. They're very, very opportunistic. And when you catch a wild salmon, it fights you. It looks you in the eye and it says, "You can't have me." And salmon and June hogs that used to go up to BC were like 80, 90, 100 pounds. And a friend of mine, when I was interviewing American Indian fishers, he said he was an older man, 70, and he was on a scaffold and he was catching a fish in a dip net, and that fish hit his net so hard that it pulled him to his knees and he almost fell in. And he said, "The last time that happened to me, I was a kid, and I fell off my scaffold and nearly drowned." He said, "But," he goes, "what it made me think of was the salmon is fierce, it's wild, and what an honor." So I think that that's the difference for me when you've got a system that's embedded in mutual respect. And there's nothing like, I think, salmon cooked over a barbecue pit with alder smoke and on sticks. And there's nothing like having your grandma make you salmon in the oven, and eels and smelt and all these things that are really powerful food. And you don't need a lot of it. Like sometimes I will pack dried salmon with me because if I get stuck someplace, I have it with me. And just like somebody pulls out the candy bar, I'll pull out my dried salmon. So that's the difference for me.
Mutual respect. I love that. That says a lot. Eduardo?
Salmon, yeah. So that was the like iconic item that I knew of when I first came to Seattle. And funny enough, like I actually avoided putting salmon on my menu for a long time. It was just because like everyone in the city was putting it on their menu, and I learned to appreciate salmon more. I visited a few reservations and had talks with the natives. And just like understanding the deep history and what it actually meant to the land, or to the people that was on the land, I realized like the importance of actually celebrating salmon and never actually putting farm-raised salmon on my menu. So
do you approach it any differently than other ingredients when you do put it on the menu?
Other ingredients, as of like how do I cook salmon, or how?
Or do you think harder about having a salmon dish on there?
Yeah, I think about it. I try to. My restaurant's a lot different than most Seattle restaurants for the most part. So I try to figure out ways to showcase salmon other than how I guess most other restaurants typically showcase them. I don't fear showcasing lower grades of salmon and not just sockeye or king salmon. I think it's important to support all the wild fisheries and the variations of salmons that we have, the variety of salmons that we have. And so like, I focus in differently than what most people, when king salmon season open and everyone's paying $27 a pound, like that's not what I want to do as a chef to be sustainable too, because I don't want to charge $54 a dish for salmon, which we do see, you know. So yeah, I mean, I'm thoughtful about what salmon I put on my menu, when do I put it on my menu, and how I put it on my menu. And again, I never would put Atlantic salmon or caged salmon, as we saw the big issue in Seattle with over 250,000 Atlantic salmon breaking out because they were caged in the waters outside of Puget Sound.
That was our version of a scandal,
Yeah,
for sure.
basically. And we basically had the sheets covered over us, and you know, we were told something different. And I actually, personally, as a chef, I didn't even know that happens, that we would bring Atlantic salmon over and cage it because of the bounty of seafood that we have and the bounty of salmons that we have. And you know, we need to take care of our own waterways rather than bringing something else over, now pretty much an invasive species, to our waters now.
And Gail, a little different for you being in where you are.
Yes,
in Oregon.
but salmon help us tell our story on the farm. And very, very importantly, we were the first hop farm in the United States to be certified under what's called Salmon Safe. And it's a certification that really, the name's brilliant because the focus of the certification is the farming practices that we do, the inputs that we put into our crops, how we irrigate. All of those are with a strong emphasis on how does that relate to the waterways that either abut our fields or the water that we're accessing to irrigate our crops. And so we have, as of now, all of the acreage that we grow is certified under Salmon Safe certification. I started to do it because I knew that as I was starting to have more contact with craft brewers, and it was an exciting time to be able to have that relationship, that I needed to know a way of how I could communicate what we were doing on the farm, what we had been doing, what we needed to make sure we maintained our integrity and continued to do. There are those things where you stay awake at night in farming. and there have been times where I have thought, I have to say, that I've thought, have I gone too far to confine myself in some ways in not being able to have any sort of input that I can put into the mix of growing a crop because of limitations of not wanting certain chemistry that would make its way too quickly through the soil profile or stay too long on the soil profile that could then make its way into the waterways. And I've had a few sleepless nights, but I have to say that to be able to take our farm to 100% Salmon Safe certification has reduced the inputs that we have put into growing our crops. It's helped us manage our water use, which is so important now. We never thought we would have to be managing water in Oregon, and it saved us money.
I think we are to our question and answer period right now. There's so much more I would like to ask you, but I'm sure our audience has questions too.
The audience does indeed have questions. The first question is, in what ways are you all engaging younger generations in the preservation and reclamation of food and culture of the Pacific Northwest?
Well, you know, the craft brew industry is a pretty young generation of consumers. And I think that just being the connection that the craft brewers are being able to make to the farms and to hops. You know, throughout the generations, my grandparents, my dad, and my mom and dad, when someone would say, "So what do you grow on the farm?" and they would go, "Hops," and they would say, "What?" And today, that's not the answer I get. So to be able to just be connected And to be with, I mean, people in the Northwest, they have a special place in their hearts for the outdoors. And so I think being able to be connected to what's happening, where their food is coming from, where not only Oregon brewers are able to tell that story, but our hops make it across the United States into California, Colorado, Wisconsin, Michigan. And so all of those brewers are able to connect with that younger generation as to what's happening in Oregon, what's happening on the farm.
I think with me, I think food is better with a conversation. And as a kid, I ate with my family, and we often never talked about the history of my food that I was eating. And I think with my newest restaurant, June Baby, I'm now able to share my story, my history with my son, which is, that's the personal impact that I'm having on youth. Beyond the fact of actually educating people about the foods of my history, and a lot of people can relate to me, but may not know or have never known about like the history of how their food got here, why it was cooked, and when it was eaten and how it was eaten. So the story that I'm able to tell now is very important to me personally, for the fact that I get to educate my son, because my grandmother actually didn't. Maybe she wasn't comfortable, but she just never talked about why we ate chitlins, and why we had chicken and rice, and why we ate pork neck bones, and how she learned how to cook collard greens. So it's what I'm doing now is what's touching my soul, and I think it's going to touch a lot of other people's soul, and especially my son, to be able to understand what I do and how I do it.
That's good. Well, I grew up in rural Oregon, and if we didn't have gardens, we didn't really get much vegetables. There wasn't a lot out there. We had coming from a family of ranchers as well as fishers, so we had cattle that was, not fed grain, but lived on a land like we did. And we also had, like I said, when we were growing up, I lived outdoors. My grandparents, who raised me, took me out in the land and told me stories about that land, told me stories about the fish, places to get things, that type of thing. But from a very young age, we're taught respect, like I described to you. When you set the table, you give regard to all of the things that are there. The one thing that I think is really hard for people to understand is these foods give back to us. Salmon feed the land. I mean, when bear eat wild salmon, or when they eat their salmon, they poop all over the place, and that brings nutrients to the land. So we've been missing a lot of those nutrients from the Pacific that were brought back by these salmon when they spawned. The other thing that is really important was that we were trained from a very young age to be hunters and to be gatherers. I was teaching a class in 4th grade or 3rd grade, I think, and we were talking about first kill and first salmon. And all of these kids that are 8 years old had practically all of them had their first kill. Women, the girls and the boys, had caught their first salmon already. It was something that they've already participated in and were trained in the safety of and all of that. But what that tells me is that we kind of are integrated into our family unit as providers very early. And I was at a dinner, a winter dance dinner, and my great aunt got up and she brought this boy who was 8 years old, and she said, "We are eating here today for 3 days because this young man got his first elk. And we want you to know where your elk came from, and we want you to be proud of this young man." And all of these old timers got up and they're pulling their pockets out. I gave him a pocket knife, another guy came up and gave him this fresh hanky. And I mean, they were rewarding him and putting him up, holding him up, and making him feel good for himself. And you have to learn how to kill humanely. Because if you kill something unhumanely or inhumanely, you poison your food with these fear hormones. So it's not something that you learn, just go out and shoot something. You go out and learn how to shoot it correctly. And I think that part of what I know is that these animals give themselves to us. And my friend Larry Avacana went and got a whale for his village in Barrow, Alaska, and he said to me, well, my people are going to eat this winter, we got a whale. And we talked about it, and he said he was out. He says, it's funny, when you're out just boating around, kayaking, he said the whale comes up to you and looks at you, and you look at it, and it goes on its way. He says, when I'm out hunting, the whale looks at me, and it's fierce. And he said, but when the whale gives itself to you, it's a different thing, meaning that your family back home, your women, your grandparents are praying for you, and then you catch or you kill that whale because it knows you need to feed your people. So that's something he grew up with. I don't think there's a way to do that except in the Americas. For a long time it was Boy Scouts, right, and Girl Scouts. But now we have a lot of young people who are really anxious and need to know and want to know how to take better care of the land. And when I go to speak in schools, they want to know different things. You know, you take a walk down the street and all these weeds are actually edible foods.
Yeah.
And it's really important to teach that.
I think we have a little less than 5 minutes. Do we have time for one or two more?
Absolutely. This is a somewhat related question. One of the audience members would like to know, how do you get consumers to share the same sense of pride in locally sourced food that you have?
For me, it's like I think every day is an education lesson for my staff, which are an extension of me, who then do their job to educate the consumers coming in. I'm open about where I order, how I order, who I order from. I'm cautious of that and conscious of that, and I think that's like dictated in the food that I serve on a daily basis. And I think that the consumers that actually come to my restaurant understand what I do, how I do it, and the cost that it takes to do it. So they're willing and able to support that. We can talk about, I guess, the encyclopedia, at June Baby.
I
it's a
was
whole.
thinking about that with the last question on education also.
Yeah.
Because at one of the panels this morning, one of the panelists said, well, here in America with our regions, where's our La Russe gastronomique? And it reminded me that you, for June Baby, have an online encyclopedia telling people what is served.
The encyclopedia kind of morphed as I took a journey back to the South, and I went to like Memphis, Nashville, Charleston, Birmingham, and just ate at all the mom and pop restaurants that I can get my hands on. And it just took me back on the fact of there's so much regionality to Southern food in America. And, you can go to one city 5 minutes away and, the gumbo that you have is going to be different than the other city. So I realized, like, it started off as I'm going to blog about my journey. And then I realized there's so much, so many different things in our cuisine from a Southern standpoint that people may not know and aren't educated on, and I felt it would be very important to have basically a encyclopedia or a glossary, just walking the line of what ingredients are and where they came from, from the common peanut to corn, and the origin of corn. We didn't have corn here in Charleston or in Idaho. It started in Central America, Mexico. And it was given to us by the natives. And, I think people actually don't know the history of that little grass that became corn. It's important for our guests to kind of understand, like, the foodways so that they can have a greater appreciation for what they're actually eating and when they come out to eat to my restaurant. So
I'm getting a 1 minute warning here. Did you want to add anything to this, or can we cram
I think loyalty to a really good restaurant's important. I've been part of parties that have been like visited by chefs who come out to say hi to us because we love their food, and I think that's important. That's the only thing I can add to that.
Yeah, consumers are so important in being able to make change and to be able to sustain change.
Are we out of time? I'm so sad. Thank you so much for your wonderful conversation.
To our panelists for this eye-opening discussion. We will take a short break and begin the next roundtable at 3 p.m.